old friend Cliff White. Thank you for the introduction and the invitation. To Brad and Richard, Tricia, Joe. I was asked by Cliff to talk about Central Europe, the collapse of the socialist world and its effect on all of us, and particularly on our economic and trading system. Let me just begin by saying something that at least I feel, as someone that was born a long time ago, 1930, and has seen the world go through a lot of changes. I just cannot imagine a more exciting time to be alive. I can't imagine a time that would be more fundamentally important to the future of my children than right now. In so many different ways. We've seen technology change the way in which we live, work, communicate with one another. I recently lost my mother, and thank goodness, before she passed away, I had an opportunity to take advantage of the video camera. And I sat down with her a couple of years ago with the camera on and just asked her questions about her growing up, because I wanted my grandchildren and great-grandchildren to know her and to know what kind of a world she lived in and how different it was. And I asked her about how it was growing up. Did she remember, she was the oldest of 5, did she remember any of her brothers and sisters being born? She remembered them all. They were born in the home, as they were in those days. And I said, what was it like? What kind of, appliances did you have? And they had a radio. They had obviously no television. I said, well, what kind of refrigerator did she have? And she said, well, we didn't quite have a refrigerator. We had ice boxes. And the ice man came about three days a week, and we'd take a big box of ice and stick it up in the top of the ice box, and then keep our food cool. And I asked her about when she met my dad, and when they'd first kissed, and it's just a wonderful thing, and I'm so grateful that I have it. But the point is that my children and now my grandchildren just really have no conception of that kind of world. We have the ability today, after hearing the Club of Rome, Cliff, talk back in the 1960s about the world coming to an end, as Malthus did 100+ years ago, and all the prophets of doom have found out that they were just fundamentally wrong. We now can take a strain of wheat, literally, carve one little corner out of the genetic instructions in the particular type of wheat and implant some new instructions. So we can take a normal strain of wheat, and if we're going to grow wheat in sub-Saharan Africa, we can make that wheat drought resistant. And if we're going to grow some wheat down in Malaysia, where they have monsoons, we can make it resistant to too much moisture. And if there are insect problems, we can literally, this is true, we can do it today, we can insert instructions into that particular type of wheat to produce its own insecticide, so when an insect bites it, it dies. We can do that right now. We're going to be riding, there are trains today being pilot tested in Germany and Japan that ride on magnetic levitation, about that high above the ground, just 2 magnets that reverse against each other and hold it up above the ground. They can go 300 miles an hour. They're very fast and they're efficient. They will be powered by superconductivity, which means that you can get your power to them with no loss during the transmission, so that they will run much more efficiently. We have computers now that do a billion computations a second. We transfer $400 billion a day around the world in financial transactions. $400 billion a day transferred from one country to another in nanoseconds. It really is a different kind of a world. We worry about pollution. There are a lot of firms working now on a ceramic engine. The advantage of a ceramic engine, and it is being driven, cars are being pilot tested with these engines today. The advantage is that that engine will operate at much higher heat than metal. The advantage of that, of course, is that you get 100% burn of the fuel so that you improve your fuel efficiency by 30%. Additionally, you burn all the fuel, so you don't need a catalytic converter. So you don't need a water cooling system because the engine block will operate at a higher temperature. You don't need a catalytic converter, and you get 30% more fuel. And if you think that isn't going to change the steel industry, you're crazy. It's also going to change the environmental mix. It's going to change the energy mix. Things are happening every day that make this world just fundamentally different. Maybe the most dramatic change in technology is the technology of communications. In the 1920s, after World War I, the French, in their wisdom, decided that they had flat had it with the Germans. They didn't ever want to be invaded again, and they were going to flat see to it that they were not going to be invaded. So they started to build probably the greatest engineering feat of the first part of this century, something called the Maginot Line. And it was an engineering marvel. Everything was underground. The only thing that was above ground was the muzzle of the gun, and there was no way that the Germans were ever going to come through that Maginot Line, and France was protected forever. Except that when the Nazis took over Germany and they decided to invade France, they went around the line. Maginot Line mentality is still with us. Next example was after Harry Truman and the hassle we had over Berlin with the Soviet Union, and the Cold War began. The Soviets decided to build the Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain, as Churchill called it. So they put this dividing line, and they shot anybody that tried to cross it without their consent for the next 40 years. The only problem with that wall was that it was a physical wall. And what we learned to do in that 40 years was to communicate by satellite, by VCR, by fax machine, by telephone, by almost every other device, so that the flow of information was going over and around and through that wall like it didn't even exist. And all of a sudden, the wall collapsed. Because it was an irrelevancy. It had just as much effect as the Maginot Line did 50 years earlier. One of the great experiences I've had in the last few years was the privilege of chairing something called the National Endowment for Democracy. And we were started after Ronald Reagan made a speech in London in which he said it is time for the free world to learn how to communicate and sell its ideas and not just its products. We ought to be about the business of helping build democratic institutions in other countries. And so we've been doing that for the last 7, 8 years now. We've been funding dissidents like Václav Havel and Violeta Chamorro and Lech Walesa, people in countries who were given denied the privilege of freedom. To see now the fruits of those labors coming to bear as Václav Havel becomes the president of Czechoslovakia and Violeta Chamorro defeats the Sandinistas in our own country of Nicaragua. To see the change, that fundamental change, as the people of those countries engage in what is the most remarkable peaceful revolution that we have seen in this century is an awesome thing. And I think it's due to the fact that, first of all, the Western world stood firm in defense of its basic convictions, its basic values, did not deviate, people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, the peoples of their two countries, said, we will defend these things that we believe in. We built up our defense, and we built up our economies, and we articulated our values, and we promoted them. And we tried to help those in those countries that shared those values. We met with Mr. Havel's brother, Ivan Havel, in the dark of the night up in an apartment on the 5th floor where you had to walk up because there's no elevator in Prague, to give him a briefcase in which was a VCR or a fax machine. And now he's president of the country. I happened to be in Hungary last summer, and I was asked to go and to speak to a small group of people on how they could transition from a collectivist statist economy and a collectivist statist Stalinist political system to a free country. And it was one of the more remarkable times of my life. I was just there for a couple of days, but in this particular meeting, we were together for about 5 hours, about 12 hours in the room. About half were communist officials of the government, and about half were the opposition leaders who won the election just the day before yesterday in Budapest. And it was a fairly tense kind of an evening. We were going back and forth and arguing about how best to move to a free society and a free economy. And one of the more articulate young Free Democrats got pretty violent in his language, and he was just chewing on the Congress. He said, "You communists are so incompetent. You communists couldn't run a 2-car funeral," is the way we'd say it in Tennessee. "You do everything wrong. You've messed up the country, you've messed up the economy, you've messed up our relations, you've messed up your military." And all of a sudden, the leader, the General Secretary's chief of staff, the Communist Party, just exploded. He said, "Quit it. Just quit it right now. Quit using those negative terms. Quit calling me a communist." And I almost fell out of my chair. It was the most remarkable comment I've heard. But yesterday we saw what he meant. The communists, quote, by label, got 8% of the vote in Hungary. You look at these things, you see how they're changing, you see the drama of it. When Havel wanted to come to the United States, his brother Ivan came over, and I had a small dinner for him, and we were talking about the difficulties they were going through. A lot of comments were made that were just so important to me, at least. He walked in the room. One of my friends who was with the press said, there were only about 8 or 10 of us, said, "Before you sit down, I got to ask you a question." He said, "It's really been bothering me." He said, "Could you have conducted your peaceful revolution? Could you have done what you've done? Put yourself from jail to the presidency in 2 months without a spiritual basis to what you were doing?" And Havel hadn't been asked that question before, and he thought a minute. He said, "No." He said, that's an interesting question, but he said, "No, we couldn't. We had an intrinsic set of values that were spiritually based, religiously based, ethical values that said that there's something wrong with a system that puts people down like we've had in this country." We went on to talk, and one of the other people in the room was a very aggressive businessman who wanted to make some investments over there, and he says, "You just drive me crazy. You won't give me any answers about what kind of tax policy. How am I supposed to make an investment in your country if you won't tell me what kind of tax system you have?" And he said, "Mr. So-and-so," he said, "I'd like to answer your question." But he said, 2 months ago we were in jail. 2 weeks ago we took the presidency. He said, "We don't know all the questions, much less the answers yet." But he said, "I will tell you this." He said, "If you look in your history books," he said, "the United States took about 10 or 15 years to write its Constitution. And when you got through writing a Constitution, you didn't pass the first bill as a tax bill. The first bill you passed in Congress was the Bill of Rights. He said, you had to establish a civil society. He said, that's what we got to do. Give us time. He said, if you're willing to pay your fair share of taxes, you'll do all right in our country. But let us establish a civil society. All of this is to say, what's happening in a major, important part of the world is so fundamental, such an enormous break from the last 40 years that it is going to change the way the world thinks and works and operates. One specific thing I would like to spell out. In talking about Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, even Nicaragua, there really is something happening that is exciting and productive for us. But I do want to make a distinction between those countries and the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union is fundamentally different. Whereas Czechoslovakia has some history and some residual institutional memory of the workings of a market economy and a political pluralism, Russia has no such institutional memory whatsoever. Long before the communists came, the czars were there, but never have they had a true market system, never have they had true political pluralism, ever. So there really is a difference there. There's another kind of a difference, too, and that is that because Russia has been under the domination of people with this particular economic and political ideology for so much longer, the deterioration is much worse. The president of the National Bank of Hungary, in a conversation with me, said that his problems were unbelievable, awesome, difficult, whatever word he wanted to use. But he said, if you think we got it bad, he said, you got to look at the Soviet Union. And he said, the Soviet Union is where we were in 1964. He said, we are at least 25 years ahead of the Soviet Union in Hungary. The physical and emotional deterioration of that country is just unbelievable. The sidewalks, the roads, the housing, the plumbing, you know that, what was the story, Cliff? The guy finally got a commitment from the government that the electrician would come to repair his wiring in his apartment in the year 1999 in January. And he was furious, and the guy said, why are you mad? We finally made a commitment to come. And he said, that's the day the electrician is supposed to be there. They tell these stories on themselves, but these are not so funny over there. In Hungary, this is true, it's 9 years from the day you apply for a telephone until you get it. If you're a business, it's a year and a half. It's hard to do business like that. I had a conversation with a guy named Bogomolov, who is head of the Russian economic unit in their National Academy of Sciences, who advises Gorbachev on how to move the economy. And he was talking about how difficult it had been to get people to accept just basic concepts. He said, we've understood the concept of depreciation in Russia. For instance, 1917, we know that equipment wears out, and you got to set aside money to replace it, that it's made technologically obsolescent by new ideas, and you have to set aside money to buy those new ideas. Plants, the same thing, you have to replace them. Depreciation is an understood concept. But he said, under Marx, we were not allowed to have a deficit. And if we had put depreciation into our accounts, that would have given us a deficit. So we didn't have depreciation. So we're 40 years out of date. The only thing we have modernized is the military. And he said, we have a very, very long way to go. And then there were four of us in the conversation, somebody said, well, early today, Mr. Bogomolov, it was proposed that in order to ensure Gorbachev's survival, that the West should come up with $30 billion worth of consumer goods so that the people would be patient and let the reforms work. What do you think? He said, don't do that. Please don't do that. And I'm obviously paraphrasing significantly, but he said, we have made the mistake. We have got to cure the mistake internally. And we'll eat up those consumer goods in a country our size in 6 months. Then what? People are going to say, well, what next? We have got to put our own house back in order from the ground up. You listen to that, you listen to the honesty of the responses in some of these other countries, you look at the courage of the Poles who are a desperately poor country and who have stopped all state subsidies of food, of housing, of factories in order to put their economy back on a market-based competitive footing. And the short-term pain of that is unbelievable. And yet you got people saying we're willing to do that because something else comes with it. And that's not just freedom, it's opportunity. They are trying, and they are convinced that it will be better. You wonder why it took so long. There's a tombstone in Tombstone, Arizona that I took a picture of because I couldn't believe it. It was so perfect, but I got it in my office. The tombstone says these words, nothing else. I told you I was sick. Isn't that wonderful? They still are. They got a long way to go. It is going to be very difficult. Lots of tough political choices. Temptation to take the softer route, to try to cushion the thing, to go halfway. You know, you're already hearing people talking about the third way in East Germany. This inhumane capitalism may produce a lot more goods, but it's not very humane. So maybe they ought to have a third way, sort of halfway house between socialism and capitalism. If they do that, they're going to continue to die. They have to do some very tough things, but they're doing them. The effect of all of this is really not too easy to predict, but you're going to see, I think, some considerable variation. The West German government is so emotionally involved in East Germany, the unification of that country, that there just is no question about what's going to happen there. They're going to take it over, they're going to merge the two, and they're going to spend whatever it takes to bring those two economies into line with each other. And in some ways, the West Germans, while it's going to be an enormously difficult task, have a long-term perspective that is very valuable to them because they've been running out of people. The ability to get another 16 to 18 million people who are talented, good, strong work ethic, and who can be trained to do the modern jobs is an economic opportunity for Germany. It's going to be difficult in the short term. That's why the markets are depressing the value of the mark and increasing the interest rates over there. But the longer term, you know where that's going to end up. The interesting question is what's going to happen politically, and at least the conversation right now is the most fascinating conversation I ever had, because as one of the papers noted this morning, the prospects are that the West German government will keep American troops to keep the Russians at bay and keep the Russian troops to keep the Russians from being insecure for several years and pay for both of them to be there. It's the most marvelous Alice in Wonderland kind of world we live in. But those two countries are going to be one country, and it's going to be an economic giant of enormous consequence. I think you can predict that Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and perhaps even Poland have a pretty good chance, maybe not even money, but a fairly decent chance of coming out with relatively market-based economies that in many areas are pretty competitive. You can question Poland just because it is so desperately poor. You can question Romania and Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, for somewhat the same reasons. The question really goes to a matter of degree as these countries stage back into the political system. We are going to have a more fragile world over there for some time, maybe more incendiary in some ways. Russia even more so. You see the pressure on Gorbachev from Lithuania. The reason Lithuania is so important is that it's the precedent. It's not Lithuania, it's Georgia and Ukraine and Tashkent and all of the Muslim republics down south. And there are people in the Soviet Union who really are saying, hey, why don't we do without them? That's not exactly what you'd call the military's attitude, but they have an enormous continuing problem. And even the leniency with which they've approached Lithuania has sent signals, and you now see really large demonstrations going on in some areas that are fundamentally important part of the Soviet Union as an empire, and down in Georgia and the Ukraine. Let me stop looking at Central Europe just for a second and try to pull this into what I think is the larger context. Going back to what I said earlier about technology, the geopolitical events that are driving us to a very different kind of a world in economic and political terms. We are going to live in the most radically different kind of world in the next 10 and 15 years that any of us have seen in our entire lifetime. The agrarian world that dominated our thought, political, economic, social thought, for 5,000 years lasted through the great majority of recorded history. Then we had the Industrial Revolution, and it lasted about 150 years. And then we began to talk just 20 years ago about entering the post-industrial world, and that only lasted 20 years. We're now in the knowledge world, the information world, the communication world. And the effect of these changes on people, on businesses, on governments is going to be absolutely enormous. Just give you an example. We have thought about production in the United States as if it were sort of a national thing. But the firms that are multinational firms are going to be running what I call a global factory. They're going to be producing in whatever location makes sense that month, wherever the markets drive them to. The customers of the world are internationally sophisticated. They see television, too much television. One of the frightening things I saw over the weekend, unrelated to this whole speech, but it really scared me to death, is that the average parent of a high school student in the United States talks to that child 15 minutes a week in this country. The average individual in the United States in this country now spends 7 hours a day watching television. You tell me what kind of a world we're going to live in if we don't do something about that. Having said that, let me just go back and say that what television is doing as consumers is making global consumers out of us. And there's less and less nationalism in our production and in our buying. What that says is that production cycles are going to be much more consumer-driven, much more subject to short-term demand shifts, so your production runs are going to be shorter, your product life cycles are going to be shorter, your new product introductions are going to be much faster, and firms are much less dependent upon the cost of labor as a primary cost of their sales dollar. The cost of production, cost of labor in the United States will very quickly go below 15% of the sales dollar. Now, the percentage of Americans on an assembly line is now down to 12%. By the end of the century, less than 5% of the American people will be on any kind of assembly line. Doesn't mean they're not working in manufacturing. It doesn't mean we're not producing more goods. It means we're producing it in a different way. More efficient, more value-added, more cognitive value-added skills. But you're going to have global factories producing in those countries where there is a stable political environment, stable exchange rates, a high-quality workforce, an educated workforce, where government understands that capital, taxes, environmental regulations, those things have to be designed to be efficient in the larger competitive sense, because the kind of competition we're going to in the world, if the Cold War is over, and it's not quite over yet, I think we're a little too quick to reach that judgment. Let's assume, though, it is declining in importance. What we're going to see in the next decade is a different kind of competition. There's going to be a competition between different forms of capitalism. Japanese capitalism and U.S. capitalism, third world capitalism like in Taiwan and Korea and the Philippines or Thailand, and European capitalism. It's going to be a different kind of competition. It's going to require a different reaction from us. You remember the old cliche, the optimist said, "This is the best of all worlds," and the pessimist agreed. We're going to be asking that kind of question in the future. It is an incredibly interesting, fast-moving, productive world, hopefully politically more stable. But we haven't answered the questions about what we do to make sure that our participation is both productive and healthy. Jean Kirkpatrick has made a speech. She and I were together recently, and she was talking about the fact that in this century we've done something that was really interesting. We have tested every governmental concept that's ever been articulated from the time of Plato on. We tried them all. Socialism, communism, whatever you name it, authoritarianism, and we have found all of them wanting, all of them lacking. And we are now in a position where one seems to have at least been better than all the rest, but it needs a lot of work. And that's free enterprise, freedom, political freedom and economic freedom, intertwined, interrelated, inseparable. There really is nothing that equals the human opportunity that comes from that combination. You take that as at least the conclusion you can draw from the last 90 years of this century. And then you look at this evolving international competition, Europe coming together in the Europe 92 process, the Central European countries desperately trying to get out from under the socialist burden, Asia coming very fast, not just Japan, but half a dozen countries that are new Japans, improving their ability to compete. And then you look at the question, well, if the issues we're having to deal with in the future are competitive issues between economic systems of capitalism, and if you look at the fact that the issues that are going to be driving the politicians to act are macro issues in global terms, like the environment, which can't be dealt with by one country by itself, just won't work, international third world debt, global growth, AIDS, drugs, terrorism, all of those are issues that are external to the capacity of any single government. They require an action that goes beyond any one country. And you got to ask the question, well, what systems or institutions do we have in place to deal with those things? And the answer is not much. What country has the capacity to lead? Only one. It isn't Japan, for sure. Japan has yet to decide that it's a global power with all the progress they've made. They've yet to accept that responsibility. It can't be Europe. Those 12 countries haven't even agreed on how to open up their borders yet. They will in the next few years, and they're going to be much stronger competitively. But it can't be Europe because the political dimension to allow them to reach a conclusion on macroeconomic issues isn't there yet, and probably won't be until certainly early into the next century. So it really is us. And in the face of that, you got all these people saying, well, you can forget the United States, it's gone. The declinists, as some of them have labeled them. Paul Kennedy wrote a book called The Decline and Fall of the Great Nations? In effect, it was saying that the United States has had it. Like everybody else, we've over-obligated ourselves and can't afford to do what we're doing. Baloney. I really worry that we're going to talk ourselves into a mess. We have the capacity to do that. Peter Drucker, who's one of the brighter people in this world, wrote a book that was not as negative, but it's a little scary. It's called New Realities, and it's worth reading if you haven't. And he talked about the single issue paralysis, our incapacity to act on tough questions politically. That is a matter of some concern. The fact is that we are a global economy, and as a country we are more vulnerable now because we are truly interdependent on the well-being of other countries. It is fragile because it's new. But in that equation, remember that the United States is not just the largest country, the largest economy, not the largest country, but we're the largest exporter. All this talk about Japan, we're still the biggest exporter in the world. We're the largest trader. We're the most open, the most productive, most entrepreneurial. Every month in this country, 50,000 new businesses are formed. No country in the world has an entrepreneurial instinct welling up out of the grassroots of its country like we do. Sure, we got a huge deficit, and we ought to be dealing with it. But in the 1960s, defense was 50% higher as a share of our budget, and it was a much smaller budget. And today it's down to 6% of our GNP and going down. In the last 10 years, we have leaned down. We're more competitive. We are the safest country, the most stable country. 1950, which was the peak of some people's memory, we had $1.6 trillion in gross national product. Today it's 5.5 in the same value of dollars, 5.5 trillion. It's 2.5 times Germany. Japan. That's 5 times bigger than Germany. In Japan, it takes 1 hour to produce what an American produce in 31 minutes. We're more productive by far than the Japanese and the Germans over our whole span. Now, we're out of whack in a few areas, which we've got to put right. But overall, we're still the most productive people in the world. Japan's growth exceeded ours recently in the last few years by 0.7%. At that rate, it'll take them 136 years to catch up with us. I'll let my kids worry about that. We say we're deindustrializing, but in 1973, we had 36% of the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the top 24 nations in the world. We had 36% of their industrial production. Today we're 39%. The German percentage is down, the British percentage is down, the French percentage is down, and we're the only ones that are up, we and the Japanese both. We do have some things to deal with. The thermometers are running up. The red line on the thermometer says we got a trade deficit. The red line on the thermometer says we got a fiscal deficit. The red line on our thermometer says we are not doing an adequate job of educating our schools in the public schools in the United States. Those are red lines on the thermometer. We got to find the source of the heat. Congress wants to put a lid on the thermometer. You got to turn down the heat. We got to find that source, which means we got to deal with more effective tax, regulatory, incentive policies, and better education policies. But the fact is that we are just an awesome country. We're the one country that has the capacity, and I pray the will, to lead. The collapse of socialism occurred not just because of technology. It occurred because we were the alternative. We were the example. Václav Havel, when he made that wonderfully effective speech, an important speech to the Congress of the United States, said that you Americans, are the example. You're the beacon. You're what we held up. You were our hope. Because you were willing to assume the responsibility, the personal responsibility that is required. And we're not talking about living by bread alone. We're talking about something going deeper, the values of this country and what we really stand for. In the middle of the time of turmoil in Prague, a Czech worker grabbed a Czech flag with the troops beating up people around him, stood up on one of the parapets and started reciting. You know what he recited? Verbatim, the Declaration of the Independence of the United States. When the students took Tiananmen Square, they didn't carry the red flag of socialism. They built a model of the Statue of Liberty. And we're so blessed. We have a lot to do to put our house in order. But we're so rich in so many ways, it really is time for us to decide to do it.
The kind of world we're going to live in is a world in which we're going to be tested. Our muscles are going to have to be used, mental and physical, and intellectual and spiritual. But it's a world in which the opportunities are fantastic for our kids. World trade, when I took the job with Ronald Reagan in 1981, was $2 trillion. Today it's $3 trillion. I will guarantee you before the end of the century it's 9 trillion, maybe 10. It's going to triple. That means that the two economies the size of the United States are going to be created out there in the next 10 years. It's our size. That's our market. That's our opportunity. We can take that. We can take what's happening in Central Europe as an economic component of the miracle. We can take what's happening in Central Europe as a political part of the miracle that can help us achieve a more peaceful world. And we can give our children the kind of a world that all of us would dream of for them. Thank you very much.